All right. Good morning. Thank you for joining us today as we discuss the latest research from the Archbridge Institute on economic mobility. My name is Ben Wilterdink, and I'm Director of Programs for the Archbridge Institute. If you didn't know, the Archbridge Institute is a nonprofit, nonpartisan, independent public policy think tank, and our mission is to lift barriers to human flourishing. One of the primary ways that we do that is by conducting rigorous, high-quality research on all things related to economic opportunity and economic mobility. So today we have two of the three co-authors of our most recent report, which is titled Intergenerational Mobility, Social Capital, and Economic Freedom by Justin Callais, Vincent Geloso, and Alicia Plemons. I'll start by briefly introducing our two presenters today, and then I'll hand it over to them for their comments. After that, we'll take some questions from the audience. So please use that Q&A function in your Zoom chat, and we'll get through as many as we can in our time today. So to kick things off, first, we'll hear from Vincent Geloso. Vincent is an assistant professor of economics at George Mason University. He obtained his PhD in economic history from the London School of Economics and previously worked as a postdoctoral researcher at Texas Tech University, visiting assistant professor of economics at Bates College, and assistant professor of economics at King's University College. He's published more than 60 academic articles, and his latest book, Rethinking Canadian Economic Growth and Development Since 1900, it's in 2017, examines the social and economic convergence of the province of Quebec with the rest of Canada. Following Vincent, we'll hear from Justin Callais, who is a research fellow at the Archbridge Institute and the lead researcher for the Institute's Social Mobility Index project, which is forthcoming. Justin is an assistant professor of economics and finance at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. He earned his PhD in agricultural and applied economics from Texas Tech University and his BBA in economics from Loyola University, New Orleans. His articles have been published in journals such as the European Economic Review, Journal of Comparative Economics, and many others. So from there, Vincent, I'll let you take it away.
Thank you very much, Ben. So the best way to start in terms of motivation of what we're doing is the idea that in the last decade, maybe two last decades, there's been rising discussion of the topic of inequality. And one of the reasons why inequality is considered to be an important topic is because it often seeps into the questions of mobility. The idea being that highly unequal societies will offer fewer options for both absolute, which means absolute mobility, which means the chances of out-earning either your parents or your past self in the future, or relative mobility, the idea that you can climb over the income ladder to reach the top, to have rags to riches story, the idea that inequality is a big impediment for this. This motivation has created a large number of research. Most notably is that from Raj Chetty and his team at Harvard University, where they created, using very rich data sets, measures of mobility, which they then tried to connect with other concepts such as social capital, to see if, for example, the rich stuck up with each other, that limited chances of the poor to access network of economic knowledge, allowing them to climb up. So they tried to expand the conversation from just inequality per se to a wider topic than that. Now, the issue is that when you read through this literature, it is largely a literature that evolves inside an institutional vacuum. So if you look, for example, at the work of Raj Chetty, when the words markets appear, they generally mean they really mean labor market conditions, which means that market are kind of like exogenous factors that drop in from the sky by godlike intervention, and they are given to us and we can't play with them. When the word institution appears, they generally only refer to educational institutions like colleges or universities. They never speak of institutions in a richer sense of property rights, regulations, open trade, occupational licensing, elements that would together combine to speak of how much opportunities is there on markets, for people to use their skill or act as entrepreneurs and have open possibilities for climbing up. In fact, I challenge you to go on Google and just Google the terms income mobility and regulation and put the operator brackets around it saying you want exactly that sentence, income mobility and regulations. You will find only one article, and that one article is written by Justin here. It's literally n equals one. There's only one article that mentions the role of regulation. If you try to expand it a bit, you'll have sometimes people do a castaway mention of this, and then they never talk about it again. So questions of how much, what the role of markets is, and the role of institutions in allowing markets to flourish, has been largely excluded from the conversation. And this is kind of a problem because you can't work in an institutional vacuum. You cannot assume that things just drop from the skies. In fact, many of the variables you look at, like even inequality has a strong connection to the type of inequalities that emerge if, for example, the institutions create state-level mandated monopolies that protect certain firms from competition, or that reward certain rent seekers for through political privileges like tariffs or barriers to entry for themselves, which in the end up creating inequality, which end up, if you agree with their argument, ends up creating lower mobility for society. So you can't just forget about the role of institutions. So here in this paper, the goal that we have is to bring in that role of institutions, to consider what's the importance of, more precisely, not just institutions, but one measure of institution that we think is quite important is the institution of economic freedom. And by economic freedom, I'll just make sure we define what we mean. Economic freedom, you can define it in two sets of components. The first one is the institutions that provide an infrastructure for voluntary exchange, protect individual and their properties from aggressors. So basically, these, you can think of these as the regalian function of the states, the protection of property rights, policing, courts, justices. But also institutions and policies that refrain from actions that interfere with personal choice, voluntary exchange, and the freedom to enter and compete in labor and product markets. This definition of economic freedom, which is generally very widely used in the empirical literature regarding economic freedom, is what we plan to employ. And the reason why we think it matters is in two ways. First, the presence of economic freedom matters in the sense that it promotes upward mobility by not putting barriers in the ways of people. That means that, for example, it's possible for a person in a low-income household to open a business that might end up being highly successful, thus allowing a rags to riches story. But it could also be a story of the economic growth that economic freedom allows. And there is a large literature emphasizing the importance of economic growth to develop economic freedom to economic growth. If you're able to promote it, it actually often ends up increasing the choice sets of people who are poor by giving them extra resources, which they value much more at the margin than richer households. So it gives them more opportunities they can exploit, going to acquiring some training, acquiring some skills, getting the seed capital needed to start a small business that ends up succeeding. And so there's these two mechanisms that together combine for giving a strong emphasis. So the direct removal of impediments to upward mobility, but also a permissive environment that ends up multiplicating the opportunities that people have. So what Justin, Alicia, and I have done, and what we're doing in subsequent projects, is to try and get to both the associational importance of economic freedom to income mobility, and later on the causal importance of this. And in this paper, what we do is use exactly the data that Raj Chetty and his team, the very known data from Raj Chetty and his team, were using it as is, but in link with lower levels of economic freedom within the United States, with the intent of checking out whether economic freedom matters to promoting to promoting mobility. And to kind of give like a short resume, and I'll let Justin go into more of the, I'll let him give the big takeaway graph, the one that looks really nice, is that economic freedom matters so much more than people realize, even within a high economic freedom country like the United States. Because I forgot to mention this, the Raj Chetty data is subnational data at the county level in the United States. Well, not at the county level exactly. I don't want to get into too much of the details, into the commuting zones, what they call that mobility is much higher in the richer places within the rich, in the freer places within the freest country, one of the freest countries in the world. So even in a highly free environment, it still matters. Small variations matter a great deal to upward mobility. So I'll leave it to Justin to kind of explain our results. And from there, I'll be happy to take questions with Justin as well.
All right. Well, yeah, thank you very much, Vincent, for the great motivation. And thank you to Ben and everyone at the Archbridge Institute for the invitation. And thank you to everyone who's joining to listen to this webinar. So yeah, so like Vincent mentioned, I'm going to talk about sort of what exactly we do and kind of what the results look like. So like Vincent alluded to, we're going to look at Raj Chetty's own data, both on mobility as well as on measures of social capital, and then combine that with economic freedom data to look at what's the relative importance of social capital and economic freedom in determining mobility. So if you look at, when we talk about Raj Chetty's data, we're looking at him and his team have a measure of absolute mobility, which is basically how much better are you doing kind of overall. So they specifically look at what's your income rank. If you, for a person in an area that was born at the 25th percentile, so at a very low, poor income household. And basically because the starting point is so low, we see that as, or Chetty and his team sees that as absolute mobility, because any gains there are only going to come about from true absolute gains in one's income and one's climbing the income ladder. But we also consider relative mobility, again, from the same data, which is basically just the relationship between a parent's income rank and its child's income rank. And the idea here is basically the idea is that, and you would ideally want this to have a low relationship. And the idea that, just because you were born in a poor area doesn't, or a poor income household, doesn't mean that you're destined to be in a poor income household. So ideally there's a lower relationship between, the income rank of your parents and the income rank of the child, because that suggests that people can kind of move up on their own and they're not just stuck in the situation that they're in. And then we also interestingly look at the racial gap, specifically the white-black income mobility gap, which is basically the difference between income mobility between whites and blacks in a given area. So we're going to look at, these are kind of our outcome variables, the variables that we consider, that we look at. And we're going to combine this with, again, Chetty's own social capital data. So most importantly, we're going to look at what's called economic connectedness, which is basically the sort of bridging variable. The idea is that it's the share of high or above median income friends who have friends that are below average income levels. So the idea that basically people of different income groups are friends with one another. So it's the idea that basically it's called bridging social capital, in the sense that it's bridging income groups that would otherwise not be necessarily as connected. So what extent do those areas have that sort of out of their own group friendships? But we're going to look at what's called bonding variables, social capital variables, again from Chetty. And this is basically the idea that it's more like within group friendships. So basically the idea is like, what's the odds that if you're friends with someone and you have two friends, what are the odds that they're friends with one another? And that sort of bonding measure we're going to look at as well. And then we also consider economic freedom, which again is what we see as sort of the missing link in this literature. It's one of the things, again, that Vincent mentioned that is considered sort of exogenous or outside of consideration when we say no. We think that it's especially important. And again, especially important within the US, even though the US is already one of the freest countries economically in the world. So we're going to use data that Dean Stanzel from Southern Methodist University collects, which is metropolitan area economic freedom measures. And he looks at government spending, which is basically the how much government consumes in terms of the local income, the amount of transfers and subsidies, the amount of social insurance, those things, because the idea is that government spending is going to crowd out private spending. We're also going to look at taxation, so how much, basically, what does government take in, and this is looking at income, payroll taxes, sales tax revenue, property tax revenue, so tax revenue from a bunch of different places. So again, the idea is that the more the government taxes, the lower the returns are from one's own investment or income or just any sort of returns that they earn. And finally, they consider labor market freedom, which is basically based on minimum wages, government employment shares, the idea that, again, you're crowding out private employment, and private union density. And for the purposes of this paper, we're going to look at sort of your lifetime measure of economic freedom. So how free of a area did you live in throughout your entire lifetime? So this is all, again, at the metropolitan level. We do note that, while we think economic freedom matters, it is not the only relevant measures of market friendliness. So we use other measures, such as regulatory environment, licensing, in subsequent projects, and we're going to find, similar results. So the idea here is that we're going to use all this data, basically, again, the data that Chetty collects and their team collects on mobility and social capital, combine it with data from economic freedom, and see basically what's the correlative relationship between these variables to mobility. So to sort of briefly introduce it, we're gonna mainly gonna find that economic freedom pretty much always matters for mobility. Economic freedom as a whole and those kind of within components that I mentioned, like government spending, taxation, and labor market freedom, essentially those matter for mobility. And they don't really seem to hurt the income gap that we see between blacks and whites in this country, which we find very interesting. And we have this very interesting graph that we'd like to show that's going to basically show exactly kind of what's the relative importance of economic freedom. So here, if we look at basically, so we look at, on the left side, we have economic freedom with respect to absolute and relative mobility, and kind of what's the effect of mobility that you have from being in an economically free area at different quartiles. So if we look at the fourth quartile or the most free areas, we see that absolute mobility rises by 12% and relative mobility rises by 13%. So we find this to be basically a pretty large effect, right? If you're in the freest area, you're going to see your income mobility rise by a lot. Compare that with the economic connectedness data, which is from Chetty. Again, that's that bridging social capital, which is the idea that friends of different groups are friends with one another. And they find, also that economic connectedness matters. Absolute mobility and relative mobility goes up in the more connected area that you are in. And we find this to be very important because the right-hand side is something that people have already stressed and already pointed out, is that economic connectedness or social capital matters for mobility. So, again, we find that this is true. But we think the most important part of this is that we're also finding that economic freedom matters a lot too, right? If we look at absolute mobility, it matters to the same extent that economic connectedness matters. And furthermore, we find that they're basically additive. So essentially, what this means is that if you find a place that is very economically connected as well as really economically free, you're going to see these massive gains in mobility, which we find to be, extremely interesting and important, considering the fact that people haven't really considered this in the literature before. People haven't looked at economic freedom. And we find that whenever you do consider it, you're going to see massive gains again, along with gains from social capital. So it's not like you have to choose one or the other. It's really, ideally you can have both. We find this important because there's really little that governments can do to determine social capital measures, right? Government, it'd be weird for the government, or the government can only do so much with respect to friendships or making sure people of different income groups are friends with one another, right? But what they can do is determine the policies that they have, right? So this is kind of a call to saying, look, there's a lot of things that policymakers can do to help fix mobility, potential mobility issues that exist in the US. And one of the main things is market friendliness or economic freedom. And that's kind of one of our big takeaways from this paper. So to go into a little bit more detail quickly before we take questions, basically whenever we compare both the relative importance of economic freedom and connectedness, we find again that both matter for absolute and relative mobility, but they don't influence the racial mobility gap. We do find, though, that when you compare economic freedom to those bonding measures, which are basically the ways in which people within the same group are friends with one another, we do find that economic freedom matters, and that measure of social capital either doesn't matter or actually hurts mobility. And the idea is that basically people can bond together to get granted special privileges from the government, then they can do so, and they can do so, to their benefit, but to the detriment of the rest of society. So basically, economic freedom can counterbalance those effects, right? If you give the government less power in which that they can, less power that they can use, there's less special privileges that they can grant, which then is going to matter, for mobility for everyone, right? Because the people who can best get these government privileges are those who are already in a well-off situation. So we find that matters a lot. So again, bonding variables either doesn't matter for mobility or negatively hurts mobility, and it actually widens the racial mobility gap, while economic freedom always matters for mobility and doesn't have any negative consequences with respect to racial income gaps. So essentially, what we're finding is that economic freedom is a big missing link in this literature. And again, we kind of stress that this is a sort of lower bound finding because we're already in one of the freest countries in the world, right? So this is just small marginal changes in economic freedom in an already really free area can have massive effects on mobility. So I think this, is just the starting point in looking at kind of what drives mobility. And I think, more interesting work can be done on both on these types of projects, but also ones that look at other areas that have a much, wider distribution in mobility, as well as, that are less economically free. What happens in those areas whenever we get more economic freedom, what happens and how is that compared to social capital in those areas? And I'll end on this note. So we find again that economic freedom matters for mobility, and it matters to the same effect or more than social capital. And it almost always outperforms the effect of inequality. So again, the reason that people point to inequality is because that the reason people care about inequality is because they care about mobility, at least indirectly, if you listen to their arguments. So we find that, even if given a level of inequality in an area, economic freedom is going to matter more. So you can use economic freedom to counterbalance any negative effects of inequality and counterbalance any negative effects from certain types of social capital that can actually be bad for mobility. So again, we see this as a call for future research. We see this as a call for policymakers that can, again, if we care about social mobility and we care about income mobility, we really need to look at economic freedom. We really want to care about that just as we care about other social capital measures that people have already been concerned with. So again, we see this as the missing link there. But yeah, so I thank you again, everyone, for your time, and I look forward to answering any questions or comments that you might have.
All right. Thank you, Vincent. Thank you, Justin. We're always interested in finding missing links here at Archbridge. One question I wanted to start off with, and then we'll go to some of the audience questions. So audience members, you still have a little bit of time to think about your questions. Go ahead and put them in the Q&A down at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to as many as we can. But just taking moderator's privilege here a little bit, you guys mentioned how you looked at different MSA levels, and that's sort of the level of analysis that you were looking at. And I certainly appreciate the additive quality of these economic freedom variables and the social capital variables, specifically the bridging social capital variable that you mentioned. Are there any places that jumped out at you that were pretty high in both of these variables, or pretty high maybe in one variable and not the other? Or conversely, maybe were there any places that jumped out at you that were poor? They ranked very poorly in terms of bridging social capital and or economic freedom, just to kind of give us a sense of some of these places that are doing well or maybe doing worse.
So we didn't check if anyone was in like the sweet spot of high economic freedom and high income, high economic connectedness or high social capital. It's probably something we should probably emphasize on doing, because that means that there's a benefit to it. But I should point out that if anything, our results probably underscore the importance of economic freedom. Because there's a large literature that kind of argues that once you have big change in economic freedom, you find increases in level of social trusts between people, largely the idea being that there is some degree of substitutability, not between economic freedom and social capital for mobility, but between economic freedom and size of government for producing social capital. The idea being that often governments replace informal governance structures that people have tinkered with for a long period of time, and which means that if government steps back a little, civil society can step in, and these informal governance mechanisms can re-enter into play and thus add themselves to the economic freedom effects then on mobility. So our results are kind of intuitive, but it means that when we're looking at the effect of social capital per se, we are kind of saying of economic freedom, we are by definition, I could do like a simultaneity proof of this, but the simple point is, by definition, we are understating the true effect of economic freedom. So we're lowballing it in this version because of the mechanism we've just stipulated.
Yeah, and going off to that, off on that point, at least looking sort of just kind of roughly at the data, you can see that there's, and this is something that even Raj Chetty has pointed out in terms of, and it has used it as examples in terms of linking social capital to mobility, is that if you look at places like the Midwest, many places in the Midwest, like North and South Dakota, as well as Utah, you see places, so really the Midwest and some Mountain West areas seem to be the best at mobility, and some of the best at social capital. But if you look at economic freedom, there are also places that have really high levels of economic freedom. So again, this isn't to say that social capital does not matter to any degree, but also, I think, someone like Raj Chetty just pointing out of, oh, look, these places are, have high levels of social capital and mobility. There must be some link here. We say, well, but they're also one of some of the freer areas in the U.S. So I think that's important to look at too. So just kind of taking a brief look at the data, that seems to be that a lot of places that at least those 2 or 3 states kind of point out as places that kind of hit that sweet spot in terms of high social capital, especially the good types of social capital, high levels of economic freedom, and also high levels of income mobility.
Yeah, I think something that might be a little counterintuitive to some of the people who are listening to this, or some of the people who might be interested in these topics, we tend to link and just kind of lump social capital together all in one bucket, right? So you've got the social capital bucket, and so you did a good job of differentiating between these kinds of different social capital, bonding social capital on the one hand, bridging social capital on the other hand. Uh, can you explain a little bit in more detail of why, in particular, I think it's understandable why bridging social capital can be so important in terms of getting people in terms of mixed incomes together. There's sharing knowledge, there's sharing opportunities. I think that's a little bit more intuitive. But I was kind of surprised, frankly, to read that bonding social capital had such a negative effect on some of these things that we care about a lot. And so I know you covered this a little bit, Justin. You kind of speculated of why we might see that, but I'd just be curious if you guys, if either of you wanted to weigh in, if you had a few more thoughts on why bonding social capital seems to either be neutral or negative, and what that might look like in terms of real world applications, in terms of things that people are doing, organizations that people are in, institutions that you think are particularly representative of bonding social capital. So it's maybe try to take it a little bit more out of the abstract for us, and what would bonding social capital look like?
So I Justin, I'm taking it because I really like that question. I would say that bonding social capital is good for group members, but generally the point of bonding social capital is to be somewhat exclusive. And you want to restrict access to other people to that particular group. And that means that it actually gives you an edge in terms of organizational abilities, maybe over other groups, and maybe in terms of talking to legislators. So, for example, one group that has very high bonding social capital, trade unions. And trade unions were very mildly opposed to conscription, largely because there is a literature showing that trade unions kind of liked the draft for some period of time. You find also that strong opposition to, you find out actually, like in my neck of the wood in Canada, who opposes immigration to a large degree, trade unions. You will find that generally their bonding social capital is used to seek privileges, which means that, yes, it may help the mobility of group members, but it hurts the mobility of out group members. So non-members are hurt by bonding social capital. So its effect is ambiguous in the sense that it helps on one hand and it hurts on the other, whereas bridging is much more unambiguous in the sense that it allows people to reach up, collect new information, to access new types of knowledge, to copy by observation. So that way you're seeing different mores and practices, and you can more easily copy. There's some form of cultural evolution that can take place by noticing the habits that are most generating of prosperity or success. So bad habits kind of disappear. The ability to bridge is generally unambiguously pretty beneficial, largely because its point is about including more people inside the group, whereas bonding is really about the cohesiveness of an existing group in a certain way. It's not maybe the best way I'd summarize it, but bonding social capital allows for rent seeking, which then can hurt outcomes.
Yeah, the idea is to kind of emphasize the idea is that since they because they already have a lot of similarities, both in terms of this could be in terms of like where they live, so they might be geographically close to one another, or maybe industry close to one another, right? Depending on which way you want to look at it. Because they're so similar, their cost of organizing is going to be lower, right? If you're trying to get together a group of people that are very dissimilar, it's much harder to get them to collectively organize for a given cause. But if they have low cost of organizing, already due to similarities, again, like trade associations or any sort of association that then goes to lobby for regulations or privileges or subsidies, or barriers on potential other entrants. You're going to see that again. That's like Vincent mentioned, that's beneficial for the members, right? But typically is seen as bad for mobility overall, because precisely because it's pushing others out, right? Again, the point is to be exclusive and to kind of restrict. So they're doing precisely that.
Okay. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I'll just remind the audience that you are free to put questions in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. But in the meantime, I want to keep going on some of this stuff. I think one thing that is interesting, we're often told that markets or capitalism or late capitalism or what have you creates an environment where the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. That's a phrase that you hear fairly often from some sections of the political commentary. But this study kind of pushes against that, I think, in some pretty dramatic ways, especially in terms of intergenerational economic mobility, which is something that I think we all care about very much. One of the key findings I thought was really interesting was that not only does economic freedom help in terms of these absolute economic mobility variables and relative economic mobility variables, but it actually helped those at the bottom of the income ladder more than it did for the people at the top, which really cuts against that rich get richer, poor get poorer sort of phrase that you hear sort of tossed around. So can you explain sort of how you found that particular finding and maybe speculate on a little bit more on like why you think you're seeing that dynamic in the data?
Justin, you want to take it?
Yeah, sure. So again, it is one of those kind of common things that you just kind of hear thrown around. But as soon as you look in the data, something that doesn't seem to actually hold true. So if you look at both the work here, but also other work that Vincent and I have done either together or separately with others, is kind of the idea that economic freedom is the best sort of removing of barriers with respect to helping those at the bottom succeed. So I have a paper with Andrew Young at Texas Tech that looks at economic freedom at across countries as opposed to just within countries, and finds that basically these economic freedom reforms or these sorts of large increases in market liberalization or again capitalism leads to incomes for everyone going up, right? That everyone's incomes rise, and there's really no true effect on inequality. And actually, if you look at the very kind of niche specific kind of minute parts of the data, you find that income is most highly rising for those at like the bottom 30-40%, as well as those at the top 20-30%. And then everyone's gaining, but in terms of relative amounts, you see that the people at the bottom and the top are gaining to the highest degree. So they're the ones that are really having the largest effects, even though everyone's incomes are rising. So I think this speaks to something along the lines of people being able to move income deciles or move within the income ladder from sort of capitalism. Again, if we think about, again, we have this sort of public choice way of thinking about government versus public interest way of thinking about government. So I think those who often would seek economic freedom as a barrier to mobility as opposed to a way of removing those barriers would see sort of capitalism as, oh, well, it's really just pushing privileges towards people who are already rich, and it's just only going to widen the income gap. However, if you look at, who are the people that typically get these government granted privileges, it is those that are the richest, right? It's already people who are very connected and have the expenditures and the time and the excess income to lobby for privileges, right? So someone at the bottom doesn't have the money to lobby, or doesn't have their time or the returns that they can expect by pushing the legislators to do things for them. It's much more burdensome for them, right? Because they're just trying to survive. So if you see who's actually the people getting these privileges, are you seeing the people who are actually who regulatory burdens are actually harming? It's not those who are at the top, right? Most regulations are not set at kind of pushing those at the top to be more equal. It's really pushing those at the bottom from ever actually rising, precisely because the people who are pushing for those regulations are those who are already connected and already doing well off. So I think that's what some of the main mechanisms through which you would expect economic freedom to actually do the opposite of what a lot of people think, which is remove barriers and allow for people to kind of flourish in their own ways.
I would just add a little something here regarding the importance of economic freedom. Um, it's one of the low cost ways of doing things, because the conversation right now is generally concentrated on big spending push on education to promote mobility through education, without considering the possibility that maybe education is a signaling more than it is human capital. There is very little consideration of what could go wrong in big drives. There's also big conversation over the role of early childhood outcomes, all of which kind of make sense. The issue is that they're all they're all solutions that will take a very long time, and there is uncertainty about whether or not they'll yield the promised effects. I don't think it would be negative. I think it'd be very stupid to say that more education would yield something worse off than now. But the question is it really worth what is it going to yield the effect that people say, especially then when you compare with reforms that right now could probably matter so much more and probably allow us to get some educational mobility independent of big spending drive by governments. So, for example, occupational licensing is very depressive of upward mobility for people in the low deciles. Higher minimum wages also, and this is preliminary work I'm doing with somebody else, and kind of like this is part of the big team that Justin and I are trying to assembling as the income mobility group that talks about other policies. Minimum wages, when they're increased by a very large proportion, tend to lock in groups for a very long period of times. There's really solutions that are cheap, are in the realm of policies that are about deregulating more labor markets, that are about increasing the returns to doing work, that are about making the cost of living lower, making cities more accessible by eliminating housing regulations that make high productivity areas inaccessible to low income people. All of these are lower cost policies that would yield also effect relatively rapidly. So this is probably the reason why we want to emphasize this. And it's not us dissing what's been done. Social capital does matter. Education does matter. Early childhood development does matter. What we're saying is all of these are hard to manipulate. And in fact, we should maybe be a bit skeptical about the ability to manipulate them from the get-go, whereas, and their effect take a long time, whereas what we say effects could be much faster generated, and also be much less ambiguous with regards to the size and magnitude.
All right. Well, Vincent, you anticipated my last question here, which was going to be on policy implications or some final thoughts for either state lawmakers or people who work in and around public policy. But I think you sort of tied that up nicely there. I think to close, then I just want to ask if Justin or Vincent, if either of you have any closing thoughts, either kind of building on what you've said about some of these policy implications. I really like this bang for the buck angle. It's always important to consider how we can best spend our resources, both political capital, time, that kind of thing. Or perhaps maybe some final thoughts for other economists who might be listening or might be interested in this as well. So just any kind of closing thoughts that you might have.
I'll add two conclusive thoughts. The first one is something I've been emphasizing for years. Intervention is different from redistribution. It's possible to have policies that are about helping the very poor by transferring resources to them, and those do not require large regulations, trade barriers, unsafe property rights. They all require modest taxation and direct transfer with the fewest conditional terms targeted towards the very poorest. You don't need more extra stuff. For example, you say you want to have public education, you want to have universal education. Sure, you can have universal education. I think it's a good thing in and of itself. But you could also not have government schools. You just need funding to help the very poorest access schools, which is entirely different than having a state provision of schooling. These measures are very different. So if you separate intervention from redistribution, you can get more economic freedom by allowing markets to work. And only once you've allowed them to do their stuff, you maybe like take a little out of the pie and then retransfer it so the pie is allocated differently so as to promote mobility. They're not antithetic to each other. We haven't made a case against redistribution at any point, and I don't think we plan to. The other thing I would say is I'll give like kind of a highlight of upcoming papers that we're doing. One we're working on right now. There was a province in Canada that did very radical market reforms in the early 90s, and that was the province of Alberta. And you can see it goes up on terms of economic freedom index by very high proportions. And what we did is Canada has really great intra-generational mobility. So it's yourself against your past self is what's being looked at. And we checked, okay, this is a very extreme reform. The other provinces don't do it. Let's try to use causal methods. But this way we can break out of the associational linkages we were drawing, and let's go for pure causal ones. And what we find is that the reforms, even though they cut the size of government, like just to give you proportions, they cut spending per capita adjusted for inflation by 32%. They privatized 3 crown corporations. They cut the Gazette of Regulations by a fourth. They reduced the time to open businesses. They cut corporate taxes. They cut income taxes. They adopted a flat tax. And what we found is that all of these together caused a major jump in income mobility from the poorest decile. So everyone gained. The poorest were able to climb up the income ladder due to those reform. This is something we plan on doing. I'm also doing separate work on the effect of minimum wage increases on persistent poverty. So how long a person stays under the poverty line, and similarly on economic freedom and lasting poverty as well. So not just the minimum wage, but other policies, all of which are corollary to the same thing. And overall, I think it's clear that we can make this earlier case that I was saying. You can, if you let more place for markets to work, you will get more mobility. You will probably also get more wealth, which means that you could do more of the social policies that are targeted towards helping the very poor, which, I mean, maybe you're a hardcore libertarian at one here that says, no, this is not a good idea. The welfare state is bad. I don't have a strong opinion on that. And I much prefer the idea of let's look at the thing that we know hurts a lot. And these are these regulation, these barriers to trade, the unsafe property rights, occupational licensing. These are probably something that everyone left or right could end up agreeing with and would be the easiest policy solutions that could be adopted.
Yeah, kind of going off of that, I think that kind of the main point is that this is just the starting point in this research, right? Again, like Vincent mentioned, if you kind of Google Scholar search these sorts of topics, there's not a lot of people talking about regulation, income mobility, economic freedom, right? Those things have pretty much been pushed aside or just completely ignored. And I think that's something that both speaks to kind of what other people working on mobility care about, but also what people who have been working on economic freedom, as kind of a push to like, hey, like this also matters, right? This isn't just making us richer, which we all care about and it matters, right? But it's also making it richer for everyone, and it's making us all, on the aggregate, better off. And it's allowing people to kind of thrive on their own. So I think, for starters, there's a lot of work left to be done in this area. This really is just the starting point. I would say this kind of pushes us towards thinking less on perhaps inequality per se and more on mobility, just because, right, again, people have used inequality as this sort of quasi proxy for mobility, with the idea that the more inequality there is, that means it's harder for people to rise. But instead, we could just look at mobility itself and see kind of what determines that, right? And again, economic freedom and other regulatory policies matter. Also, to kind of point on something Vincent mentioned, which is that sort of long versus short-term effects, right? Economic freedom can give us those benefits now because it's not going to take as much time for those policy, for those effects to show. But again, it doesn't mean that the long-term effects do not matter either, right? Like you mentioned, school choice is one aspect of a sort of, economic freedom in the sense of letting markets of education work. right? It's a different type of economic freedom that wouldn't necessarily be captured in these, but still, in the abstract or in the kind of outer layer matter for economic, or matter as some measure of economic freedom, because you're letting markets and education run as they will. And that's one way to both have, so economic freedom matters both in the short term and can have these long run positive effects. I think, again, I'll stress sort of that wealth effect of economic freedom, in terms of when in places that are more economically free, you have higher incomes. If you have higher incomes, it means you actually have more money, given a constant rate of tax rates, right? You have more money left to redistribute. So, right, if you care about redistribution and think that redistribution matters, well, if you look at places like Nordic countries, right, they are, I think there's things that they do well and things that they don't do well, but just from a pure, economic freedom standpoint, they're some of the more capitalistic or economically free countries in the world, and they have such large, massive wealth gains that they then have more money to redistribute. And again, there's a lot of interesting work that's been done on, showing that the U.S. also actually does more redistributive policies than we actually might think, and that it's not that we're just letting people out to starve. That we actually do a lot of these sort of social welfare policies. But again, it all points back to the idea: well, let markets work, and when markets do, if you let markets flourish in the way that they allow, and they kind of let the people who with the best ideas and those with the best inventions and the best ways in doing things, if you let those survive, and you allow for those kind of would-be projects, or those projects that would exist if you didn't have these regulatory barriers, that's kind of the unseen of these sorts of regulatory barriers, right? The obvious that you see is that the people who are already there get the benefits, but the unseen is that there's all these businesses that would have been started that didn't now because of those barriers. So I think removing those barriers allows us to see the sort of success stories that is really kind of what the American dream at its core is kind of all about, right? So I think economic freedom matters. There's a lot of work left to be done, and I'm just excited to see kind of where this whole literature goes.
Right. Well, we always love closing on the American dream. But Vincent, Justin, thanks for joining us today. Thank you for everyone who tuned in to watch this program. Again, the paper is Intergenerational Mobility, Social Capital, and Economic Freedom from Justin Callais, Vincent Geloso, and Alicia Plemons. To keep up to date on this research or research like this, please go to archbridgeinstitute.org. You can look at the whole paper there, download all of their data there. And also you can sign up for our newsletter to keep up to date on other webinars we'll be doing and other projects that come out in the future. So again, thanks again for joining us today. Appreciate it.
Thank you.